Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Redwood Library in Newport, Rhode Island. I am Joe Rusnak, Assistant Director of Programs, and it is my pleasure to welcome you back to the Redwood Library virtual lecture series. As Crowdcast may be a new platform for you, if during this lecture you experience any sound problems or video problems, please feel free to click the help button, which is up the top right of our title bar. It's a little help button with a little circle next to it with a question mark. For audio, please click compatibility mode, and the same thing with video. Just to the right of that help button, you're going to see a small little outline of a box. If at any point in time you would like a full screen view of what is happening this evening, please feel free to click that. This evening, we offer you something slightly different from our normal Wednesday programming, as this next lecture normally happens on Sunday afternoons, and it's the Redwood Library Music Appreciation Series. And tonight's speaker is no stranger to the Redwood. He is music director, Chamber Orchestra of Barrington at St. John's, and conductor laureate of the Rhode Island Civic Chorale and Orchestra, and professor emeritus of music at Rhode Island College. This evening's topic is late Romanticism, Bruckner and Mahler, part one. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Edward Markward.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Carolyn DuPont, for allowing me this platform yet again. I so enjoy coming to the Redwood, and I'm coming to the Redwood tonight. I must confess, to start off, that the last time I wore a coat and tie was on March 8th. And at that time, I was in the Harris Room at the Redwood Library in Athenæum delivering a talk about Johannes Brahms. I'm not sure if it's the same tie and shirt, but we hope not. Tonight, we're going to talk about Anton Bruckner and Gustav Mahler, two of the giants of the late Romantic period. One, Anton Bruckner, who was born in 1824, died in 1896, and was Austrian, is sort of the summation of the Romantic age in many ways, whereas Gustav Mahler lived a much shorter life, was born in 1860 and died in 1911. He was born and raised in Bohemia, in Iglau, which was part of the Austrian Empire at that time, and today is a geographic center of the Czech Republic. It brings to mind another earlier composer, Antonin Dvorak, who was Bohemian as well. And during one of his summers, he resided in a town not far from my hometown, a community called Spillville, Iowa, in which the population was divided equally among Czech-speaking and German-speaking people. Mahler was in the minority. The Mahler family was in the minority as a German-speaking people in the middle of this Bohemia. Among other things, he was Ashkenazic Jewish, and that is going to play a big part in his life as we move forward. Bruckner probably has been with us, and there were no sabbaticals in the amount of performances that would take place of his music up until our time. Mahler had to be rediscovered, and there were two main conductors who brought Mahler's music back to the fore. The first was Bruno Walter, who was Mahler's assistant at the Vienna Staatsoper when Mahler conducted there from 1898 to 1908. The second was Leonard Bernstein, who became a real champion of Mahler, introduced Mahler back to the Vienna Philharmonic, as well as recorded all the symphonies of Mahler with the New York Philharmonic. Interestingly, in November of 1943, Leonard Bernstein stepped in for an ailing Bruno Walter and made his debut, much ballyhooed debut, with the New York Philharmonic on a Sunday afternoon broadcast concert. Another interesting aspect, at least to me, is that Toscanini, of course, was famous for having the NBC Symphony formed for him. A lesser known fact is that Bruno Walter also had a symphony formed for him by the CBS network. That did not last as long. Any performance of either of these composers' music is generally considered to be a special event. When I first moved to Providence in 1973, the then conductor of the Rhode Island Philharmonic, Francis Madeira, was in the middle of a series in which every other year he alternated a Bruckner and a Mahler symphony. Bruckner, whom we will discuss first, was a renowned organist. He played all over Europe and in England. As a composer, he did not start to write music until he was 37 in 1861. If you get a chance, there are many fine organs in the state of Rhode Island in various churches. If you need them, I can send an email somewhere for you so you can see where they are. They're just terrific. One of the things about Bruckner's music is that he imitated the sounds of the organ when he wrote for orchestra and voices. He was a great improviser, and this improvisational skill yielded a vast quantity of ideas for his symphonies especially. And that is not unlike Beethoven, who was a great improviser. We are told that his improvisations in public concerts were much more difficult and much longer than the ones that he wrote down. Bruckner also owes his sense of form to Beethoven. As a matter of fact, Mahler as well owes a great debt to Beethoven. Excuse me while I shuffle some pages. Here we go. The other influence on Bruckner and his music was his Roman Catholic belief. He had a constancy of belief. He had a godly and lofty soul, a deep piety. His Catholicism dominated his life. His religious works and his symphonies sprang from this devotion. It's interesting also that all of his sacred works were composed before he moved to Vienna in 1868, and everything after that was spent, all his time was spent writing symphonies. His spiritual sense of purpose was an innate gift, and as we know, Mahler had to work for this same sort of affirmation and never really, I think, realized it. Another aspect of Bruckner's life is that he was largely self-taught as a composer, whereas on the other hand, Mahler indeed studied with Bruckner at the Vienna Conservatory. I think when we get to the symphonies of Bruckner, one needs to have a certain amount of patience, a certain meditative attitude as one comes to the concert hall, because you need to sit and let this music wash over you. They are long, they are big, and that is what is the end of Romantic music is all about. I'd like to play for you a couple of his sacred pieces before we move on to the symphonies. The first is a piece he wrote for the funeral of his aunt. It's called Equale Number 1 for 3 trombones. Why number 1? Because he wrote 2 of them. Here's the first one. It sounds like an early Renaissance motet or a Bach chorale, except that the harmony is more adventurous, and this harmony stems from Bruckner's admiration for Wagner. And we will discover later on that Mahler had an admiration for Wagner's harmony as well, certainly not Wagner's well-noted anti-Semitism. Note now the similarity between that instrumental work for 3 trombones and this lovely motet for voices, Locus Iste. This is the Lord's house which he hath made, profoundly sacred. It is beyond reproof. It's a four-part chorus. It's very organ-like. Remember, we talked about that he was an organist and derived some of his ideas from that instrument. It is somewhat imitative, however. We will find out that Bruckner also studied Palestrina and J.S. Bach. Here's Locus Iste. And that repeats, and then it's developed much as one would develop a theme in a symphony. I hope you noticed in the second part of that the incredible chromaticism as the descending motives in the chorus went down by half steps. It almost sounds like a Renaissance piece, as does the next work we will hear, which is the Sanctus from his second Mass in E minor. It's unusual in that it has no strings. It is written for brass, winds, and chorus. And again, I think you'll notice that it begins in a somewhat Renaissance-y style, if you will. Then he builds and builds and builds, layering the entrances until finally the brass and winds enter in a very forceful way. You will note then thereafter that, like on an organ where you have several manuals and each has its different characteristic sound, you might have woodwinds on one manual, brass on another, and if you have a third, you might have a string sound. This is the kind of technique that Bruckner adapted from organ playing to his writing for choirs and orchestra, as we will hear. This also has a very rich harmonic element to it. think it's fairly evident the influence of the instrument, the organ, on this type of writing for chorus and orchestra. There are several more masses that he wrote with very large orchestras and also a huge Te Deum. But I think this particular mass shows off the influence of his organ writing or organ playing, as it were, on the instrumental and vocal writing. We move now to the symphonies, which are considered emblematic of the final stage of the Austro-German Romanticism. I mentioned that both of these composers owe something to Beethoven. Bruckner owes mostly the form, which was inherited from Mozart and Haydn through Beethoven and Schubert and so on. And finally, Bruckner adheres to this sort of classical form, albeit somewhat larger in scope than any of the others. These composers, Gustav Mahler and Anton Bruckner, took the jumping off point was the Ninth Symphony. However, they begin to show their souls and their personalities through the music. And if Beethoven had not written the Eroica Symphony, this probably would not be the case. There's a strong polyphonic character, that is, many voices tumbling over each other in these symphonies, and the large size and use of repetition. That is why I said you probably have to be in a meditative state, because Bruckner's symphonies are long. There's no two ways about it. They are long. They're well over an hour, all except the one we're going to hear, and we won't hear all of it, which is the Romantic Symphony, number 4 in E-flat major. It was written in 1874 and revised several times through 1888. It's interesting that conductors and other composers and probably parishioners and members of the community all tried to advise Bruckner of his shortcomings and how he could improve his composing. And Bruckner did revise to the end of his life, but mostly he just said, "Thank you very much, thank you for your kindness," and he went on to the next thing. He didn't sit around like Pierre Boulez and fiddle with Opus 1 for his whole life. Here you will notice there's a little bit of a theme. We're going to play the first movement, part of the first movement. There's a theme that's very brief, and then he builds on this theme. It starts over a sort of a rumbling bass with basses and cellos, and then becomes the horn takes up the melody, other instruments, and finally we arrive at a full-blown exposition in the first movement of this symphony. And you will note both here in the scherzo and in the last movement, if we have time, there's a thing called the Bruckner rhythm, and it's 2 plus 3, da da dee da da dee da dee da da, and it's in almost every symphony that he wrote. Here then is the opening of the 4th symphony by Bruckner in E-flat major, the Romantic. And then after the powerful opening, he transits into something very Viennese. And I think you can see a connection here all the way back to Schubert and that kind of secondary theme. Very light in the strings, very danceable, almost Johann Strauss Jr.-like in the way it is put together. I'd like to play you a bit of the scherzo movement just again so we can hear this rhythm, the 2+3. It pervades this movement. I'd like to play more, but I think we must move on to Mahler, so there is some time for some questions at the end of the hour. Mahler's full-time job was as a conductor. He wrote his first symphony while he was the second conductor in Leipzig. And then he became, in 1898, the principal conductor, the chief conductor at the Vienna Staatsoper. And one must remember that the Vienna Opera Orchestra is the same orchestra as the Vienna Philharmonic. So they also played symphonic music, symphonic concerts, as well as the opera. He lasted there 10 years. There were some problems, not only with his employer, but he suffered a great deal of anti-Semitism. As a matter of fact, in 1898, in order to get the job at the Vienna Staatsoper, or the Vienna State Opera, he converted to Catholicism. He became a Roman Catholic. His young wife, Alma Schindler, Mahler, was a Roman Catholic. And even though Gustav was Jewish, and you can hear this in his music, you can hear the dichotomy between the chorales and this sort of lovely church kind of music that he writes, and then the klezmer music from the time that he grew up in Bohemia. I can recommend to you a wonderful, wonderful video featuring Leonard Bernstein. It's called The Little Drummer Boy, and he goes at this dichotomy in a most interesting and unusual and poignant fashion. Mahler, I think if we talked about him today, we would say he was somewhat bordering on bipolarism. He had extremely wonderful highs and then would plunge to the depths. And all of these come forth in the music. This is a very romantic notion that you can show in your music what you're wearing on your sleeve personally. Also, toward the end of his tenure in Vienna, he was suffering from ill health. We'll talk more about the end of Mahler's life when we do the last symphonies the next time. As a conductor, he was the leading interpreter of Wagner opera. And as you can guess, as I have intimated earlier, he he was influenced by the Wagner harmony. The interesting thing, too, or even ironic, is that Mahler, who spent all his time conducting operas, never wrote an opera himself. By all accounts, he was an exciting and impressive personality, and whereas Bruckner took his faith as a given, it was innate to him, Mahler had to struggle. He sought God in himself, in nature, in poetry, in the writings of thinkers. He strove for steadfastness, but swung from being self-assured to, one might even say, paranoia. He often said that whenever he started a new work, he felt he was a beginner starting all over. He was after the presentiment of the ultimate harmony in the universe, and in a way, although musically probably not so, I think of Mahler sometimes as being an early Charles Ives in trying to scale heights which had never been scaled before and present music that only he could hear. It took Bernstein and Bruno Walter, as I mentioned earlier, to bring his music back to life. I want to play a bit of the first symphony. Symphonies number 2, 3, 4, 8, Das Lied von der Erde, all use songs. These are actual songs with words, chorus or soloists. In the first symphony, he quotes 2 songs. One is Frère Jacques, the old Brother John round that we all learned as children, and that is in the third movement. In the first movement, he quotes a song that he himself wrote. It's a cycle called Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen, or the Songs of a Wayfarer, and he quotes the first song verbatim in the first movement of his first symphony. Ging heut morgen über Feld. Today I travel over the field. And here is that movement, or part of it. Be patient, it's coming. It starts much as Bruckner 4, very soft. Setting it up. I think that gives you an idea. We'll listen to a bit of the third movement of this Symphony number 1 in D minor, also known as the Titan. He worked on it in the summers of 1887 and 1888. As I mentioned, Mahler, his full-time position was as a conductor or music director. He generally only composed on holiday in the summers. So it's quite extraordinary, the output that he was able to give to us with that limited amount of composition time. I hope you noticed a little bit of the klezmer feeling there when the woodwinds came in, and it becomes sort of an ethnic dance, and you can just visualize these people, the Romas dancing around in Bohemia, and so that never did leave Mahler's blood, and we're the richer for it. In the late 19th century, the late 18th century, early 19th century, there were two gentlemen who collected a series of songs, folk songs, called the Knabenwunderhorn songs, the youth's magic horn. And Mahler set 16 of these with texts and collection in two parts, and then he used several of them in his symphonies. I'm going to play a bit of the original with the great Thomas Hampson as baritone. This is, I hope, yes, this is the Heavenly Life, which he used. It is part of the Knabenwunderhorn songs. And then he uses it as the last movement in his Fourth Symphony, which stands out as being classical in texture and design, albeit using a voice for the last movement. After writing 3 gargantuan symphonies, and with 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, Das Lied von der Erde, and the 10th to follow, he used this period of time to write something a bit simpler, maybe even a little bit more jolly. This is the Symphony number 4. The tune is Das himmlische Leben, the heavenly life. We enjoy heavenly pleasures and therefore shun what is earthly. No music on earth can compare with ours. And here is Thomas Hampson. And Jeffrey Parsons.
Wir genießen die himmlischen Freuden, drum tun wir das irdische meiden. Kein weltlich Getümmel hört man nicht im Himmel, gibt alles in sanftester Ruhe, in sanftester Wir führen ein englisches Lied, sind dennoch ganz lustig daneben. Wir führen ein englisches Leben, wir tanzen und springen, wir hüpfen und singen, wir singen.
And now from the Fourth Symphony. Tone higher for the soprano.
Wir genießen die himmlischen Freuden, drum tun wir das irdische meiden. Kein weltlich Getümmel hört man nicht im Himmel, gibt alles in sanftester lustig daneben, wir führen ein englisches Leben. Wir tanzen und springen, wir hüpfen und singen, wir
singen. The artists were Ellie Ameling, soprano, and the great Bernard Haitink, who just retired last year at the age of 93, and the Royal Concertgebouw Orchestra of Amsterdam. We now move to our last work for today, and it's an immense piece of music. It's the Second Symphony, C minor, the Resurrection Symphony. There are two sources of text. One, the main one which begins, is Friedrich Klopstock, who wrote a work called Der Messias, or The Messiah. And Mahler set all but the last two lines of that ode, and then he added his own text to finish off the last third of the piece. In the meantime, back to these Des Knaben Wunderhorn songs, he wrote a piece called Antonius Predigt to the Fishes, St. Anthony's Sermon to the Fishes. And it reads as this: at sermon time, Anthony finds the church empty. He goes to the rivers and preaches to the fish. It's quite delightful.
Antonius zur Predigt, die Kirche wird ledig. Geht zu den Flüssen und predigt den Fischen. Sie schlagen mit den Schwänzen, im Sonnenschein glänzen, im Sonnenschein glänzen, sie glänzen, sie glänzen, glänzen. Die Karpfen mit Bogen sind all hierher zogen, hat die Mäule aufrissen, sich zu Mörben fließen. kein Predigt niemals, den Fischen zu gefallen.
I haven't gone anywhere. And then he uses the accompaniment mostly for the third movement of this Resurrection Symphony. And I think when you hear it with the orchestra, that wonderful accompaniment that we heard, symbolizing the rippling waters in which the fish were swimming, we now hear it resembling more of a hurdy-gurdy, and we're back to a little bit of the klezmer feeling, I feel. Antonius von Padua, Fischpredigt, third movement of the symphony, and here we go. Same key. If you wonder what I'm doing, I'm fussing with volume and finding the next piece. I'm going to skip now to the last movement of this symphony. There are 5 movements. The fourth, again, is a song from Das Knaben Wunderhorn called Urlicht, or Primal Light, and it's sung by the mezzo in the version in the symphony. And it's worth looking into if you'd care to, but we need to move on to the last movement, the movement that inspires us all to try to live a better life, I think. The text, I'm going to read to you a bit of it, begins with Klopstock, rise again, yes, rise again. This all becomes, pardon me for interrupting myself, this all becomes very, very poignant, much more so as we move along through Mahler's life. He wrote this particular symphony in the summers between 1888 and 1894. As we move on through Mahler, he begins to brood more and more and has a lot of regrets. Not so here. Rise again, yes, rise again. Will you my dust after a brief rest? Immortal life, will he who called you give you. To bloom again were you sown. The Lord of the harvest goes and gathers in like sheaves us together who died. And then becomes the text that Mahler wrote. Oh, believe my heart, oh, believe, nothing to you is lost. And that goes on, and we see rising and rising in faith here. And then again, it ends with a bit of the Klopstock and some of Mahler's own text. Die shall I in order to live. Rise again, yes, rise again. Will you my heart in an instant that for which you suffered, to God shall it carry you. I have a lot of friends who become believers at this point. Here's how it opens. And it doesn't open in a way that forecasts what is to come. It opens rather darkly, I think. back it up a little bit, listen to that rising theme in the lower instruments. It becomes very prominent toward the end of the piece. And like Beethoven at the end of the Credo in the Missa Solemnis, or Brahms at the end of one of the movements of the German Requiem, I believe these are the staircase to heaven. I'll start it again. And then the chorus comes in. I must say, because I noticed that there are a couple of friends in this audience who have played Mahler and Bruckner. And when you get through with these pieces as a singer, and my wife Diana has sung this piece and the Mahler 8, you're exhausted. You're not only exhausted physically because it's a real athletic event to play these pieces, but you are exhausted mentally and emotionally as well. I remember well that after I finished my preliminary theory exam for the doctorate at the University of Michigan, which took 4.5 hours, you talk to your friends beforehand and say, well, let's go out and really have a few beers after this. And when you're done, you just want to go home and go to bed. Here is the chorus entrance. It's very soft. Rise again. Yes, rise again. Before we hear our last segment, which is the end of this great piece, I thought I'd tell you how many instruments, what the forces are. This is not the Symphony of 1000. This is just the second symphony. It requires 4 flutes alternating on 4 piccolos, 4 oboes, 2 alternating on 2 English horns, 2 clarinets, bass clarinet, 2 E-flat clarinets, 3 bassoons, contrabassoon, 10 horns, 4 off stage, 8 to 10 trumpets, 4 to 6 off stage, 4 trombones, contrabass, tuba, a battery or a bunch of percussion guys, 7 players, timpani, 2 timpani, soprano and alto soloists, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, chorus. And then he has a footnote over to the right of where he lists violins, 1, 2, viola, cello, bass, the largest possible contingent of all strings. So that's the orchestration for this. And here is the last of Symphony Number 2, after which, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them, or try to. That's all I got. So if you'd like to ask questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
All right, and I am back. And I'll share the screen with you. Perfect. And we do have a couple of questions.
Great.
Looks like the first one is from Eichnorf Nuto. Was Sermon to the Fishes inspired by St. Francis's Sermon to the Birds?
Yes. Yes, it was. But we have to remember that it was an earlier poem. It wasn't Mahler's doing, but yes.
Okay. And then we have Diana McVeigh. Do we know why Mahler never wrote an opera?
No, I don't. But thank you, my lovely wife, for asking the question, to which I have no answer. I was going to say one other thing, if I might, Joseph.
Yes.
After Mahler wrote the Symphony of 1000, the 8th Symphony, he was superstitious about immediately writing a 9th Symphony. So instead of a 9th Symphony at that point, because he knew Bruckner died before he finished his, Beethoven only wrote 9 symphonies. So he wrote Das Lied von der Erde, which is actually the 9th Symphony. After that was completed and performed, he wrote the 9th, and then at the same time he was working on the 9th, he began work on the 10th, which of course he never completed. But he had this great superstition about 9 symphonies.
Interesting. Another question by Albert Mayer. Did Mahler actually think Bruckner wrote great music?
I have no idea, but he studied with him and considered him his forerunner. So I take that to mean a mentor of sorts. So I would guess if he went to study with the man and called him his forerunner or mentor, then I would think he did admire Bruckner's music.
All right. All right, Dr. Markward, that is all of the questions that I can see. I think.
can tell you, I just see a message from a violinist here, from Karen Jackson Geary, and I'm going to quote it because I mentioned how exhausting it is to play these things. She said, "Incredible, exhausting stairway to heaven." That's from a violinist.
Sounded phenomenal. And for those of you who are still viewing with us, we hope that you join us again for our second lecture, Late Romanticism Part 2, which is slated for July 15th with Dr. Markward. And Doctor, I want to thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Joseph, for all your help. It's great. And Carolyn, thanks again for having me back.
And we look forward again on July 15th. And for those of you, if this is your first virtual lecture with us, feel free to go to our website, redwoodlibrary.org, and you can see all of our upcoming events. We do have, again, 2 more lectures with Dr. Markward, and we also have some piano concerts on the list of events. So we look forward again to seeing you in July, Doctor. And on behalf of the Redwood Library and our staff, I want to thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful and safe evening.
Thank you.